I bought the 7 most popular translations of Homer's Odyssey so you don't have to. Let's find out which one's right for you. To do this, I'm going to read the same 2 passages from each of the translations. There are trade-offs in any translation, and I'll point out some of these to you as we go. But as you listen to these passages, you should first ask yourself, which of these translations is going to motivate you to keep reading? That's the most important thing. The first passage I read will be the famous opening of the poem, because the translators take a lot of pride in the words they choose for these openings. And the second passage will be Odysseus taunting the Cyclops in Book 9, because his exclamations bring out some very different choices from the translators. I'll read from the translator anonymously, and I recommend that you score it somehow. You can use a letter grade system of A through F. After I've read both passages, I'll tell you the name of the translator and point out a few of the things I notice in it. Picking a translation is subjective, so I'm curious to hear in the comments which of these translations or any other translations that you like the most or the least. Here's the first. Tell me, muse, of the man of many ways, who was driven far journeys after he had sacked Troy's sacred citadel. Many were they whose cities he saw, whose minds he learned of. Many the pains he suffered in his spirit on the wide sea, struggling for his own life and the homecoming of his companions. Even so, he could not save his companions, hard though he strove to. They were destroyed by their own wild recklessness, fools, who devoured the oxen of Helios, the sun god, and he took away the day of their homecoming. Second passage. But when I was as far from the land as a voice shouting carries, I called out aloud to the Cyclops, taunting him. Cyclops, in the end it was no weak man's companions you were to eat by violence and force in your hollow cave. And your evil deeds were to catch up with you and be too strong for you, hard one, who dare to eat your own guests in your own house. So Zeus and the rest of the gods have punished you. So I spoke, and still more the heart in him was angered. He broke away the peak of a great mountain and let it fly. That was Richard Lattimore's 1951 translation of the Odyssey. The Lattimore translation is still used in a lot of schools, and I start with it because it sounds neutral to me. I don't hear anything too archaic or too modern in the language. You'll see that this translation, like most of the translations, is done in verse. It's laid out like poetry, with line breaks placed deliberately. We'll see in some of the other verse translations that there's also a strict meter, a rhythm in the verse. But Lattimore's verse is loose. There's no fixed meter in his writing, but he does use the verse for some stylistic effect. This isn't accidental here, that he's starting these 2 lines with many. He's carrying that through from the original Greek. You'd never know this unless you've read the Greek, or if you thoroughly read the endnotes in the translations. But you'll find that many of these translators who use verse do try to carry through some of Homer's stylistic decisions when the line and the language can accommodate it. Second translation. Tell me about a complicated man, muse. Tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed, and for their own mistakes, they died. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. In the second passage, when I had gone as far as shouts can carry, I jeered back. Hey you, Cyclops, idiot! The crew trapped in your cave did not belong to some poor weakling. Well, you had it coming. You had no shame at eating your own guests. So Zeus and the other gods have paid you back. My taunting made him angrier. He ripped a rock out of the hill and hurled it at us. It landed right in front of our dark prow. That was Emily Wilson's 2018 translation of the Odyssey. And right away, you can hear some of the modern language. She uses the word idiot for the Cyclops, and Odysseus taunts him with this phrase that feels modern. You had it coming. I find Wilson's translation to be the most direct. Poets have struggled with how to translate this word polytropos in the first line of the poem, which literally means many turned. The Lattimore translation we just read translated this word as man of many ways. Wilson's translation simplifies it here to complicated. You see the directness again when she talks about Odysseus' shipmates. Lattimore had translated this as they were destroyed by their own wild recklessness. And Wilson is so much more direct. They died. She says it so clearly. Wilson's translation feels so direct because she's doing a line-by-line translation of Homer's Greek. So there are 12,000 lines in the Greek poem, and there are 12,000 lines in Wilson's translation. But the standard Greek meter is dactylic hexameter, which is a 6-beat line, and each beat has 2 or 3 syllables. Wilson uses the standard meter of English poetry, which is iambic pentameter. That's a 5-beat line, and each beat has 2 syllables. So the average line from Homer is 15 syllables, but the pentameter line is 10 syllables. And you can see clearly here that if you're doing a line-by-line translation in iambic pentameter, you're going to have to make some choices to shorten each line by a third. There are a lot of opinions about this translation online, both positive and negative. I think you should just listen to the language of each of these translations and pick what works for you. I think this Wilson translation is the most modern and the most direct. Third translation. Sing in me muse, and through me tell the story of that man skilled in all ways of contending, the wanderer, harried for years on end, after he plundered the stronghold on the proud height of Troy. He saw the townlands and learned the minds of many distant men, and weathered many bitter nights and days in his deep heart at sea, while he fought only to save his life, to bring his shipmates home. But not by will nor valor could he save them, for their own recklessness destroyed them all. Children and fools, they killed and feasted on the cattle of Lord Helios, the sun, and he who moves all day through heaven took from their eyes the dawn of their return. Second passage. Far out, as far offshore as shouted words would carry, I sent a few back to the adversary. O Cyclops, would you feast on my companions? Puny am I, in a caveman's hands. How do you like the beating that we gave you, you damned cannibal, eater of guests under your roof? Zeus and the gods have paid you. The blind thing in his doubled fury broke a hilltop in his hands and heaved it after us. That was the 1963 translation from Robert Fitzgerald. I think the Cyclops passage really shows a difference. He's the only translator of our bunch who introduces the curse word when Odysseus shouts at the Cyclops. And he's the only translator who uses the Greek name for Cyclops. He translates it as Cyclops. And he uses Greek names for other characters, like Telemachos for Telemachus, and Kirke for Circe. We should also note the length. He's using a free verse, so no fixed meter. And because he isn't doing a line-by-line translation like Wilson was, we see the added length here for him to get to that same ending. Fitzgerald's opening is 16 lines to Wilson's 9, and he's using 125 words to her 75. They're doing different things. Fourth translation. Sing to me of the man, muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course, once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all. The blind fools. They devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god wiped from sight the day of their return. In the second passage, but once offshore as far as a man's shout can carry, I called back to the Cyclops, stinging taunts. So, Cyclops, no weak coward it was whose crew you bent to devour there in your vaulted cave. You with your brute force. Your filthy crimes came down on your own head, you shameless cannibal, daring to eat your guests in your own house. So Zeus and the other gods have paid you back. That made the rage of the monster boil over. Ripping off the peak of a towering crag, he heaved it so hard the boulder landed just in front of our dark prow. That was the 1996 translation by Robert Fagles. Like so many of the translators, Fagles is a skilled poet himself. And he gives us so many of these translations that can go two ways. He translates that Greek word, polytropos, which literally means many turns, by calling Odysseus the man of twists and turns. That description gets at the cunning of Odysseus. He's constantly twisting and turning and scheming his way through the story. But it also has a passive component, that Odysseus himself is twisting and turning, driven time and again off course, as he's shipwrecked and sidetracked on his way home to Ithaca. This is called enjambment, where the thought continues in the new line. Homer uses that enjambment in the Greek to hit the double meaning, and Fagles carries it through in the English. This is another free verse translation, no fixed meter. But if you read it aloud, you can hear a percussiveness in some of the lines. Fagles comes close to the up-down of the pentameter in this line. Ripping off the peak of a towering crag, he heaved it. Ripping off the peak of a towering crag, he heaved it. The next two translations are very different. Here's translation 5. The man for wisdom's various arts renowned, long exercised in woes, O Muse, resound. Who, when his arms had wrought the destined fall of sacred Troy, and raised her heaven-built wall, wandering from clime to clime, observant strayed, their manners noted, and their states surveyed. On stormy seas unnumbered toils he bore, safe with his friends to gain his natal shore. Vain toils, their impious folly dared to prey on herds devoted to the god of day. The god vindictive doomed them nevermore, ah, men unblessed, to touch that natal shore. Second passage. Now off at sea, and from the shallows clear, as far as human voice could reach the ear, with taunts the distant giant I accost. Hear me, O Cyclops, hear, ungracious host. 'Twas on no coward, no ignoble slave, thou meditatest thy meal in yonder cave, but one, the vengeance fated from above, doomed to inflict the instrument of Jove. Thy barbarous breach of hospitable bands, the god revenges by my hands. These words the Cyclops' burning rage provoke. From the tall hill he rends a pointed rock. High o'er the billows flew the massy load, and near the ship came thundering on the flood. Welcome back to the 21st century. That was the 1726 translation by the English poet Alexander Pope. And what stands out immediately is the use of heroic couplets. These are rhymed lines of iambic pentameter. So each line has 5 beats, 2 syllables each beat, and the stress is on the second syllable in the beat. The man for wisdom's various arts renowned. And the couplets, 2 lines, rhyme at the end. So renowned rhymes with resound. This heroic couplet format was used by Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales. Alexander Pope was a well-known poet himself, and his translations of Homer made him very rich in the 18th century. I think of Pope as a translator's translator. Bernard Knox, who writes the introduction for the Fagles translation, and Daniel Mendelsohn, who we'll get to later, both say that Pope's translation of the Iliad is the finest translation ever produced. His rhyming scheme has nothing to do with the Homeric Greek, but I think this is why translators love his translation so much, because by imposing that rigid heroic couplet structure, which would have been more familiar to readers of his day, he's able to transform Homer into a work of English poetry. Whatever it loses in fidelity to Homer's Greek, it gains as a standalone work in English. Pope spent 5 years translating the Iliad, and he burnt out on it. So when he came to translate the Odyssey, he enlisted the help of 2 other poets. Pope translated 12 of the books himself, and he gave 4 to Elijah Fenton and 8 to William Broome. That Book 1 passage that I read earlier was actually done by Fenton, not Pope. It was a bit of a scandal when it got out that he hadn't personally translated each of the books, but I think it really just added to the mythos of his translations. For a very long time, these were the most popular translations of Homer by far. Because the translation is so old, it's in the public domain, so you can find a PDF of it online. But if you buy a copy to hold in your hands, try and go with a reputable publisher. I picked up this one on Amazon because it was so highly rated with so many reviews. But there's no introduction, no notes, and no line numbers. It's a $30 copy and paste job. All right, translation 6. Tell me, Muse, the story of that resourceful man who was driven to wander far and wide after he had sacked the holy citadel of Troy. He saw the cities of many people, and he learnt their ways. He suffered great anguish on the high seas in his struggles to preserve his life and bring his comrades home. But he failed to save those comrades in spite of all his efforts. It was their own transgression that brought them to their doom. For in their folly, they devoured the oxen of Hyperion, the sun god, and he saw to it that they would never return. Second passage. But before we were out of earshot, I shouted out derisive words at Polyphemus. Cyclops. So he was not such a weakling, after all, the man whose friends you meant to overpower and eat in your hollow cave. And your crimes were bound to catch up with you, you brute, who did not shrink from devouring your guests. Now Zeus and all the other gods have paid you out. My words so enraged the Cyclops that he tore the top off a great pinnacle of rock and hurled it at us. The rock fell just ahead of our blue painted bows. That was the 1946 translation by E.V. Ryu, which was revised by his son in 1991. This translation of Homer's Odyssey was the very first Penguin classic ever produced, and it was wildly popular because it was a modern prose translation. All the translations we've read from so far try to capture the poetic qualities of the original in verse, but this translation does away with that format, and it renders Homer in prose, with ordinary sentences and paragraphs and indentations, like a novel. There had been prose translations before, but none that used language that was as accessible as Ryu's. And I think the story behind this translation is pretty incredible too. The British translator E.V. Ryu got the idea for this translation at the beginning of the Second World War, when he'd sit in the drawing room of his house after dinner and live translate the Greek of the Odyssey to his wife and daughters while the bombs fell on London. He wanted to make translations of the great books accessible to the reading public. And this translation of the Odyssey kicked off a 20-year run for Ryu as the founding editor of Penguin Classics. And in that time period, the publishing house put out 160 books. I think it's so charming that the iconic Penguin Classics started with a man translating the Odyssey to his family during the war. And it makes this book feel like a little piece of history. The novel form frees Ryu to pick the right word for the job. He's not restricted by any meter or by trying to do a line-by-line translation, or by trying to match the format of Homer's lines. He can ignore things like enjambments and breathings halfway through the line. I think this freedom is why this translation reads so clean. But you do give up some of that richness in the format that the verse translations capture when they're at their best. Here's the last translation. Tell me the tale of a man, Muse, who had so many roundabout ways to wander, driven off course, after sacking Troy's hallowed keep. Many the peoples whose cities he saw and whose ways of thinking he learned. Many the toils he suffered at sea, anguish in his heart, as he struggled to safeguard his life and the homecoming of his companions. But he did not save his companions even so, though he longed to, for their heedlessness destroyed them, theirs and nobody else's. Fools that they were, like children, who devoured the sun god Hyperion's cattle. And so he took from them the day of their homecoming. And the second passage, I turned and spoke to the Cyclops, needling him with these words. Cyclops, so now it turns out that it was no feeble man whose comrades you ate in the cave. So ferocious, so violent. Your evil deeds were always bound to catch up with you, you wretch, who had no problem eating the guests in your house. But Zeus has now paid you back, he and the other gods. My words, and then his heart became even more enraged. After breaking off the peak of a towering mountain, he hurled it down, and it landed a bit beyond our dark, proud ship. That was the 2025 translation by Daniel Mendelsohn. It's the newest translation of the bunch, and like so many of the other translations, it's trying to do something very different. Mendelsohn's doing a line-by-line translation, but he's trying to preserve as many of the poetic qualities of the Greek as possible. You can see this immediately in the line length. Homer had long lines in Greek, and so does Mendelsohn in English. There was little punctuation in ancient Greek, but Homer used the word choice and the meter to create a natural pause mid-line, which gave the poet, who was reciting the poem aloud, a chance to breathe. And Mendelsohn tries to carry this through. You can see it come together in the first line of the Greek, which fits the dactylic hexameter scheme perfectly, and has a pause in the middle. And Mendelsohn replicates the syllables, the stresses, and the midline breath in the English. He gets the enjambment here, showing how Polytropos describes both the personality of Odysseus but also his wandering journey home. He picks up the repetition of Polon from the original Greek in lines 3 and 4 like some of the other translations have done. And at other points in his translation, you'll hear sound effects in how he describes things. And you'll hear assonance, the repetition of vowels that he's carrying through from Homer. All right, give me a ranking of the translations in the comments. As long as it won't sway your own decision, I'll tell you my 3 favorites. The one that I pick up the most is the Fagles translation. His translation of the Iliad was the best reading experience I've had in the last 20 years. The Odyssey is a more grounded poem, and he respects that. But when there's a moment of glory or horror, he lets his language soar. The next video coming to this channel is a 3-hour guide to Homer's Odyssey. The guide will work for any of the translations, but I'll be quoting directly from this Fagles translation. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that video. I do really like the Wilson translation, understanding its limitations. There was a directness to Homer when it was recited aloud by the bards, and you couldn't rewind or ask them to repeat something 3 different times so that you understood it. To capture that pace of Homer, I think Wilson is fantastic. I find myself recommending Wilson a lot to people. Anybody who's intimidated by the poem or thinks Homer isn't for them, read Wilson. If you can read in the English language, you can enjoy Homer through Wilson's translation. I've also loved reading the Mendelssohn translation. When I want to study Homer, his translation is what I reach for. His introduction to the poem is fantastic. He gives a 20-page explanation of some of the key translation decisions he made. And there are 80 pages of endnotes, which are very helpful to understand the historical and mythological context of the poem, and to point out some of the style in the Greek text that he's tried to capture in the English. He also has some diagrams that are helpful to visualize important moments in the poem, like the technique Odysseus uses to string his bow. All right, enjoy the poem and tell me what you thought of the translations below.